Survival instructor Marcus Webb and Velthari xenobiologist Dr. Lissa Ventel were the only survivors of a catastrophic research shuttle crash on the uncharted world, designated in Alliance records as Theta 7. The planet was classified as extremely hostile in preliminary surveys, dangerous apex predators, toxic flora requiring careful identification, unpredictable severe weather patterns, and severely limited safe water sources. Marcus's emergency survival training was brutally clear and absolute. 3 fundamental rules drilled into every deep space explorer through intensive training protocols. Rule 1: never split up under any circumstances. Stay together at all times regardless of situation. Rule 2: preserve all resources meticulously. Every decision must be evaluated primarily based on resource conservation. Rule 3: maintain the shelter integrity. Your defensive position is your only reliable lifeline. These weren't mere suggestions or guidelines. They were survival doctrine developed over decades of carefully analyzing what keeps people alive in hostile environments versus what consistently gets them killed. Marcus and Lissa had been surviving together for 6 days since the violent crash. Their makeshift emergency shelter was reasonably defensible. They'd successfully established a reliable water source, and they had limited emergency rations supplemented by carefully identified edible plants. But Lissa was getting progressively sicker with each passing day. She'd been injured during the crash, nothing immediately life-threatening initially, but the wound had become infected despite their efforts. Marcus had used their severely limited medical supplies, but the bacterial infection was spreading visibly. She desperately needed antibiotics they simply didn't have. The shuttle's emergency black box was continuously transmitting distress signals, but rescue could realistically be days or potentially weeks away, depending on when the signal was detected and how long it took ships to reach this extremely remote system. Marcus had identified what might be a viable solution. Native plants he'd carefully observed had apparent antiseptic properties. He'd seen local fauna consuming them without ill effects, and their limited bioscanner suggested chemical compounds that could potentially fight bacterial infection. But the plants only grew in one specific area, a steep ravine approximately 3 kilometers from their current shelter, requiring travel through territory they knew was actively patrolled by the apex predators that had killed 2 other crew members during the initial crash aftermath. Getting the medicinal plants meant breaking Rule 1 completely. He would have to leave Lissa alone at the shelter while he made the dangerous journey, because she was far too weak to travel safely, and moving her would risk dramatically accelerating the infection's spread. Every survival protocol explicitly said never split up under any circumstances. The statistical data was absolutely clear. Separated survivors had exponentially higher mortality rates. But if he didn't obtain those plants soon, Lissa would die from the advancing infection before any rescue could possibly arrive. "I'm going to attempt getting the medicinal plants from the ravine," Marcus told Lissa directly. "That's 3 kilometers of travel through known predator territory. You're deliberately breaking Rule 1. I'm completely aware of that. The survival protocols exist for documented reasons. Splitting up consistently gets people killed. The statistics are unambiguous. So does untreated septic infection. Your fever is measurably getting worse. The infection is visibly spreading. If I don't obtain those plants within the next 12 hours, you won't survive long enough for rescue to arrive." Lissa was quiet for a long moment. The purely rational calculation says preserve the survivor most statistically likely to live until rescue arrives. You're uninjured, extensively trained in survival. I'm objectively the liability in this situation. Standard protocol in resource-limited scenarios? Don't, Marcus interrupted sharply. Don't cite protocol that essentially says abandon you to die. I'm absolutely not doing that. Then you're allowing emotion to override basic survival logic. I'm making a calculated risk based on actual probabilities. I can reach the ravine, harvest the necessary plants, and return in approximately 6 hours if everything proceeds reasonably well. You remain here in the fortified shelter with weapons and communication equipment. The predators are primarily nocturnal hunters. Daytime travel is substantially safer. It's definitely a risk, but it's a calculated one with reasonable success probability. And if something goes wrong, if you don't successfully return, then you survive as long as you possibly can and hope rescue arrives in time. But if I don't attempt this, you die within days from infection. That outcome is not acceptable to me. Lissa looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. You're risking your life and deliberately violating fundamental survival doctrine for someone you barely know. We've only worked together for 6 days. 6 days is sufficient time to know I'm not leaving you to die when I can potentially do something to prevent it. Marcus prepared meticulously, left Lissa with most of their defensive weapons and remaining supplies, took only what he absolutely needed for the dangerous journey, carefully reinforced the shelter's defensive barriers, programmed the emergency beacon to increase signal strength in case rescue arrived while he was gone. If I'm not back by nightfall, seal the shelter completely and don't open it for anything, he instructed firmly. Marcus, thank you, and I'm genuinely sorry you have to break your most important rules for me. Rules are specifically meant to keep people alive. If rigidly following Rule 1 means you die, then the rule isn't actually serving its fundamental purpose. I'll be back. The journey to the ravine was every bit as dangerous as Marcus had anticipated. He encountered 2 apex predators, managed to avoid the first by staying carefully downwind and moving slowly through dense vegetation. Had to actively defend himself against the second, using noise and controlled fire to drive it off without wasting their limited ammunition. The terrain was treacherous, steep, unstable slopes, ground that shifted unexpectedly, entire areas where toxic plants released severely irritating compounds when disturbed. But he successfully reached the ravine, carefully identified the correct medicinal plants, and harvested enough for several treatment applications. The return journey was substantially worse. One of the predators from earlier had apparently been tracking him persistently. It attacked aggressively as he was crossing an exposed area with limited cover. Marcus fought it off successfully, but sustained significant injuries in the violent process. Deep lacerations on his right arm and left leg that bled heavily. He was forced to stop and apply emergency field dressings, which cost precious time. The sun was setting faster than he'd originally calculated. He wasn't going to make it back before darkness fell completely. Night on Theta 7 was exponentially more dangerous. The predators were primarily nocturnal hunters with superior sensory capabilities. Moving through complete darkness was essentially suicidal. Marcus faced a critical choice: find emergency shelter and wait for morning, which meant leaving Lissa alone overnight in deteriorating condition, or push forward through the dangerous darkness and risk being killed before he could deliver the medicine. He pushed forward decisively, because the entire point of breaking Rule 1 was to save Lissa, and that didn't work if he wasn't there to actually administer the treatment. The final kilometer was an absolute nightmare of careful movement, evading predators primarily by sound analysis, using his limited remaining tech to partially mask his heat signature, crossing extremely dangerous terrain in near-total darkness. He reached the shelter approximately 3 hours after full darkness, much later than planned, injured, completely exhausted, but alive and carrying the medicinal plants. Lissa was noticeably worse than when he'd left, fever measurably higher, infection visibly spreading further. But she was still conscious, and the shelter had held successfully. Marcus immediately processed the plants into crude antiseptic treatment. It wasn't pharmaceutical-grade medicine, but the chemical compounds were correct. He applied it directly to her infected wound, gave her some to consume for systemic treatment. Then he collapsed completely from sustained exhaustion and significant blood loss from his own injuries. Marcus woke to find Lissa treating his injuries with surprising competence. She was still obviously sick, still weak, but her fever had broken. The infection was responding to the plant-based treatment. "You nearly died obtaining those plants," she said quietly, "but I didn't die, and you're measurably getting better. You broke Rule 1, the absolute fundamental survival doctrine. For me, I broke a rule specifically designed to keep people alive, because rigidly following it would have let you die. That's not really breaking the rule's purpose, that's understanding what it actually exists for." Over the following days, they both recovered gradually. The rescue signal was finally detected on day 14. An Alliance rescue ship arrived on day 16. During those additional days waiting for rescue, something fundamental shifted between them. Lissa opened up about her xenobiology research, her personal life, why she'd volunteered for this dangerous survey mission. Marcus shared more about his background, his survival training philosophy, his beliefs about when rules serve their purpose and when blind adherence becomes counterproductive. The shared experience of surviving together, and particularly Marcus's willingness to risk everything to keep her alive, created a bond that went substantially beyond professional cooperation. When rescue finally arrived and they were being formally debriefed, the mission commander questioned Marcus about his decision. "You deliberately violated fundamental survival protocol. Rule 1 exists specifically because splitting up consistently kills people. You're extremely lucky you both survived. Rule 1 exists to keep people alive through group cohesion. Rigidly following it in this specific situation would have directly resulted in Dr. Ventel dying from untreated infection. I made a calculated decision that breaking the letter of the rule actually served the purpose of the rule better than following it blindly would have. You could have both died. We didn't, and the alternative was passively accepting her death as inevitable. That wasn't acceptable to me." Later, in private conversation, Lissa asked him directly, "Why, you barely knew me. Standard survival calculation explicitly says preserve the stronger survivor. Why risk yourself for someone who was, objectively, a liability in that situation? Because survival isn't purely about cold calculation and statistics. It's fundamentally about what kind of person you are when everything else is stripped away. And I'm not the kind of person who can watch someone die when I have a genuine chance to prevent it, even if that chance is extremely risky. That choice, breaking your most fundamental rule to keep me alive, changed everything. Not just immediate survival outcomes, but us." Yeah, I noticed that development too. Months after the rescue, Marcus and Lissa were still in close contact. What had started as survival necessity had evolved into genuine relationship. When people asked about how they had gotten together, the story always came back to those 14 days stranded on Theta 7. Marcus's perspective: "I had 3 absolute rules for survival in hostile environments. Rule 1 was considered fundamental, never split up under any circumstances. But rigidly following that rule meant passively watching her die from infection. So I broke it. Made the most dangerous journey of my life to obtain plants that might save her, knowing I might not make it back alive. I broke the rule because understanding why the rule exists is substantially more important than following it blindly." Lissa's perspective: "He risked everything, violated fundamental survival doctrine, crossed dangerous predator territory alone, nearly died multiple times, to keep me alive when cold statistical calculation clearly